In this video, you'll learn what the best sectors are for dividends and dividend growth using the Freetrade UK app. Disclaimer, I'm not a financial advisor. If you seek financial advice, please see a licensed professional. Today, I'm going to be looking at the FTSE 100, the FTSE 250, and I'll use the rest of my knowledge and apply it to the S&P 500. Remember, I'm not really picking individual stocks for each sector, but rather the sectors that perform the best in dividend growth portfolios. So the S&P is accounted for, but it's not going to be the primary area where I'm researching. And technically, anything could be a sector. I got confused when I first started investing, as like they were throwing around 20 different things. Like the sectors were more specific than they needed to be. There was consumer discretionary, consumer staples, and then it would go deeper. There'd be like healthcare and pharmacy. There'd be, to go further, for instance, there'd be oil and gas, there'd be energy, and it wouldn't really be separated to the way I wanted. So I'm going to use the broad categories, which are financial, consumer, energy, industrial, materials, real estate, I was close, tech, utility, telecom, and healthcare. I think that's all of them. I may have left one out. And so I'm going to list the sectors in order of worst to best for dividend investors. And this is my own personal opinion. Do remember that they're not necessarily the best, but this is how I think they fit into a dividend growth portfolio. Firstly, I'm going to start with telecom. And recently, as in about 7 hours ago today, BT announced that they were actually suspending their dividend after 36 years of growth. And the telecom sector has taken such a beating over the recent pandemic crisis and the recent Brexit negotiations too, has meant that it's gone into pretty much a free fall. And at the moment, I believe its share price is about, I know it was 80% undervalued in the last 5 years, or not undervalued, but 80% drop in the last 5 years. And now today it lost another 8% or something. So it is a considerable amount. And the telecom sector is meant to be defensive. It's meant to hold up through recessions, and that's not what it's doing at the moment. Seeing as they're spending about 15% of their capital expenditure, which is more than other companies, which average about 8%, just to stand still because the rest of their projects are depreciating in value. This means that BT, Vodafone, or TalkTalk, they're all just stood still. The giants are just almost collapsed. And that's why I'm not putting any allocation into them at this current time. However, in the future, situations might change and it might prove more valuable. Next up is technology. Now, these stocks typically perform really well with capital growth, such as Apple, for instance. If you'd have bought that, you would have made a nice profit. However, the dividend payments, aren't that good and usually have very low dividend yields, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you're after capital growth, then sure, technology should have a higher allocation in your portfolio. I know a lot of growth investors would have this as one of their primary drivers for their money. But in a dividend growth portfolio, yes, they do grow their dividends very well, but the dividend yield is so low anyway that it's just not worth the price you're paying for the dividend yield. And so that's why personally my allocation in my portfolio is about 1%, nothing more. It's just not worth it for me at this time being, especially in the UK. The tech companies aren't as strong, and a lot of the tech companies I'd like to invest in are still private. So it's definitely a confusing sector in the UK and something I have a low allocation to. Healthcare would be quite a controversial pick to have this close to the bottom, but you can see, while yes, they do have decent dividend yields, although they're not too high, but they don't really grow them. Their dividends have been, at least for GSK and AstraZeneca, AZN, their dividends have been at the same level for the last 5 years. And this is not what I look for as a dividend growth investor. Sure, their prospective yields of 2.6% and 3.5, or maybe it's 4 or 5, they're decent. It's just they're not growing their dividends enough. And I think you're paying too much of a premium for that dividend yield they're giving you. Yes, have them in your portfolio, but perhaps have a lower allocation. Seeing as healthcare is pretty public in the UK, seeing as the NHS is free, it does mean that it's basically just pharmacies. And typically the ones that I've seen that are the most profitable are the private ones like Roche. And that would be something I would invest in should it come. They have good dividends, but I'm not going to invest too much into them, and I don't have anything currently in healthcare for the time being. And if you've enjoyed the video so far, please click the subscribe button for more investing content, weekly dividend portfolio updates, and monthly stock analysis. The next dividend sector usually has stable dividend payments with decent growth, and that is utilities. These companies are extremely defensive and unlikely to cut their dividend during a recession. However, they simply just don't provide more than that. They don't really give much, if at all, capital growth. Over the last few years, you might see, if you're lucky, a double digits growth in the last 5 years. And that's not a bad thing per se, because you want to keep picking them up for cheap. But if their price did suddenly go up, there's no way they'd be able to keep up with their yield, as they're just simply not enough. There's not enough profitability in them. But they do offer as a hedge. In moments of high volatility, you'll see companies like National Grid, which will actually hold its value very well. And even sometimes when the market is dropping, the more defensive utility options like National Grid will rise. So it is a good hedge. Materials are great for high dividend yields, but that's it. They usually keep their dividends as high as they can possibly afford, but then are not afraid to cut it. This means they try to offer you the maximum of their profits as much as possible, but this does mean that they're not typically growing them, just rather trying to give a lot of their money to their investors. And that works. But it does mean that dividend growth is very unlikely. During times of recessions, it might be cut, but it won't necessarily be suspended, and that's what they're good for. It's rare to see these materials lose their demand, so therefore it's unlikely for their dividend to be suspended, but cutting is an option. So these are consistent dividend payers, which typically have a high yield but can be cut lower. So that's why they're kind of middle of the board. They're good to own, but maybe not too much of an allocation to. It's your choice. Personally, I'm with Rio Tinto. They have a high dividend yield, but they do have a premium you pay for their price. Industrials is probably one of the most intimidating at first. You think, oh God, industry, what are they doing? And it sounds really complicated, but in reality, they're just creating certain products. And usually it's a small amount of products in a certain niche, or it's a range of products that fulfill a certain purpose. For instance, you have CRH that create cement and sell and distribute cement across the country. You've also got Mondi, which distribute paper. And these companies in the sector differ widely. They have different goals. Some look for dividend growth, some try to pay the highest available dividend that they can. But they simply don't do either category too well. They are good investments. You can get really good value on these. They are likely to cut their dividends in recessions, or at least pandemic situations, as they can't have workers or metal workers or cement workers working close together. If you're interested on how I pick, research and choose my dividend companies, click the card at the top right of the video to watch a video on how I do it. So I'm going to include real estate investment trusts with house builders into the category of real estate, and this is one of my most favourite sectors to invest in. REITs typically provide very high dividend yields, and they usually pay with high dividend frequency, meaning that you are going to be getting paid your dividends often, such as Realty Income Corp, which is a dividend REIT in the United States, and they pay monthly dividends with a decent dividend yield. It doesn't necessarily grow. Their dividend will grow over the period of time, but they don't have much room to grow it, and instead they offer as much of their profits as possible as dividends. So this means that it will be a consistent dividend payer throughout any time, but it's going to be different amounts each time. It's not necessarily cutting their dividend or growing their dividend, but it's paying the most they can possibly whilst available. House builders, on the other hand, provide amazing capital growth. Companies like Redrow have such value opportunities because of their high volatility recently, which means you can buy them low and get them on a good deal. Whilst Redrow has currently suspended their dividend, in the future they do plan on continuing in it, and I believe it's a yield of something like 3.9% at its current price, which is great. They're going to provide great capital appreciation, and they also provide a stable dividend which they can pay for with their profits. And what I really like about the real estate market is it doesn't really follow the economy or the general economy and the stock market. Not the same thing, but they link. Since real estate is its own market, sometimes if the market's going down, the real estate market might go up, like we've seen recently with the house builders actually rallying in price when the rest of the market was dropping. And that's why Redrow at the moment is currently like 15% up in the last week or so. Energy is my second highest allocated sector in my portfolio, and that's because it has just taken a complete beating. It's seen the volatility, it's dropped. But these companies usually pay very high dividends and they try their best to grow it. Yes, I know Shell has recently cut their dividend and that is an issue. They have cut it by 66%, but that's still a 3.8% dividend yield. That's still good. And that's quarterly payments, and that is what energy is good with. They typically pay a lot of their dividends like quarterly, such as BP, Shell, and they will try to pay as much as possible. And they do have chances for capital growth. At least now, with the price war, it means you've got a good opportunity to buy in. BP still has a dividend yield of around 10.5%, which is incredible. However, in the future, they are likely to cut it. But even then, they might just restart and start regrowing it from there. If Shell continue from 4%, in about, let's say, 10 years' time, perhaps they'll be up to 7%. So they will improve in the future, and they are high dividends to get, and they also present a lot of buying opportunities, so that's why I'm invested in them. Now, the next sector is very defensive, and you want to use this as your protection in recessions, as the demand for the products is usually going to be high, and that is the consumer sector. People have to buy their products in order to survive. For instance, they might be after loo roll, which would have been selling loads in the supermarkets, and the supermarkets have been creating revenue even though the country's been locked down, because people still need to buy groceries and food. And that's why I like the consumer sector. They don't necessarily have a high dividend yield, but what they do offer is great capital growth, and they do grow their dividends by substantial amounts. And this is what you want. This will protect you in recessions, and it means that you'll hold your value in your portfolio whilst giving you consistent dividend payments and growing and outperforming potentially the market. These companies come at a price, and they have very low volatility, meaning that they don't often get much value. So you're not really going to get a significant discount when trying to buy in a dip, but they will provide you year-on-year high annual growth of dividends and capital price. So that's what I'm thinking about. This sector is by far my favorite. I understand it most comprehensively, but they do have the highest volatility, which I like, which presents significant buying opportunities in recessions. They're very likely to cut their dividends in recessions, but this means that their price will go even lower, and that's when you jump in, buy them, and then sit for a few years and watch them rally straight back up. They have high volatility and a high chance of making profits, and it's financial sector. Yes, at the moment, a lot of companies have suspended their dividends, such as Aviva, Lloyds, Barclays, HSBC, etc. A lot of the banks, a lot of the insurers have suspended their dividends, and that will resume within the next year or so, which I don't mind. And currently they have got significant value in their share price because it is a good 60% lower than what it was at their recent highs in February. So it is worth buying. And this is why I love financials so much. They offer a high dividend yield, they grow it well, but they do cut it. But that's not an issue because I'm after dividend growth. I can get high value opportunities to buy more of it and then getting better money for the yield, and it's just going to compound over time. And if you've enjoyed the video so far and you want to know about my Freetrade dividend growth portfolio, click the card at the top right of the video. Thank you for watching. I'm Osborne Foreman. Have a good night.